Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history of time. Make America great again. How can you be against it?
Is President Trump at war with Washington, D.C.? Now, let's separate the federal government and the beautiful capital of the nation from the city itself, the people who live here, the people who work in the District of Columbia. Here's what Donald Trump said about D.C. on the campaign trail.
Right now, it's a rat-infested, graffiti-infested hole.
And then Trump promised to take the city away from the mayor. But fast forward to the present day, he is the president, and the DC mayor is doing this really careful dance to work with the White House, and she's even earning some praise from President Trump. Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm your host, Libby Casey, and I'm here with Rhonda Colvin, senior political correspondent, James Homan, columnist and editorial writer, and we're also joined by Meagan Flynn, who covers DC government and politics on the Post's Metro team. Thanks for joining us, Meagan.
Thanks for having me.
We also have a special guest coming up, Emily Davies, who's tracking what's happening with the federal government and DOGE. But we have Meagan here to really dive into what's happening in the heart of Washington, D.C., and how it's been so dramatically affected by the Trump presidency just 2 months in. We are literally to the day, only 2 months into the presidency. So, Meagan, there was so much focus on that big spending bill that passed Congress last Friday night, the CR, or continuing resolution. And a lot of the focus was on the politics. Would Democrats vote for it? Would they stand in the way and risk shutting down the government? We didn't get to talk as much about what was actually in the bill. There was a huge cut to Washington, D.C. in that bill that passed. How much money was cut from the D.C. budget?
Yeah, so what's interesting about this is what was not in the bill, which was this long-standing provision. It's very routine that would allow DC to continue spending its 2025 budget. Congress had already approved that twice last year. This time just took out that long-standing provision. And the impact of that would be to have DC go back to its fiscal 2024 spending levels, which was over $1 billion smaller than the FY25 budget. So the effect is that DC would have to find, according to its top officials, more than $1 billion in cuts in just 6 months remaining in the year.
Give us some perspective. What does $1 billion mean to DC?
Sure. They've really, they've stressed that this would impact their biggest spending areas, unavoidable, public safety, education, human services. So all of these critical areas that really impact Washingtonians' daily lives, they were worried, there could be layoffs of police officers, teachers, city workers. And that really alarmed a lot of people, of course, who have kids in public schools, who want their city's streets to be safe. So that's really the outcry that we saw from DC about that.
Tell us more about the outcry. What was the lobbying effort like on Capitol Hill last week?
It was pretty remarkable. There were hundreds of DC residents who physically visited these offices to plead with senators, with lawmakers to undo this cut, or to even vote against the spending bill to prevent the cut to DC. There were kids who came with their parents. They had parent-teacher conferences and had a day off of school, which they spent, actually going to visit their senators and saying, I love my teacher. We don't want, cuts to our public schools. And they really seemed to get through to senators. They knew and saw the kids in the halls. They were kind of unavoidable. There was like a flood of them everywhere. So DC residents really made some noise.
So the outcry didn't work, and yet it also sort of worked, because that cut, that lack of funding, made it through the CR. That is now law. But Rhonda, the Senate also passed a bill to give DC that funding. It's not law because the House has not passed it. What are the chances of the House actually taking that up and passing it?
Yeah, that's right. So before the Senate left town and they passed the House version of the budget, they did add that provision back in for it to be voted on by the House when they return. So Congress returns next week. Right now, what we're seeing, and this is really interesting because we're seeing the Senate be supportive of DC funding. We're seeing the White House signal that President Trump will sign it if that provision is put back in. But the House Republicans seem to be, it's not very clear what they will do when that bill comes to them next week. We're hearing right now that Speaker Johnson may not bring it up for a vote next week. He wants to talk to his rank and file members. What that might signal is that all rank and file Republican House members aren't on board right now, so he might have to whip votes. But it is interesting to see the Senate, both parties, as well as the White House say, let's give DC back its funding.
Yeah, that's what was really interesting to see was when Susan Collins took that bill to the Senate floor on Friday, she said it has the endorsement of President Trump. As well as the House Appropriations Chair, Tom Cole, she said, it was his committee where this happened. So those are two critical, pieces of support to have as this goes to the House. But yeah, I mean, it was the House where this happened, and that's really why it's such a hurdle going over there, more so than the Senate. We haven't heard from, Speaker Johnson on where he's at, but certainly President Trump's or the White House is coming out on the record to say, yes, the White House supports this bill as well.
It's fascinating, and I want to talk more about that in a moment. But first, if the House takes a while to get this, rolling on the House floor, are there short-term effects? Like, when does the budget get felt by Washington?
That's a great question, and one that we asked city officials about on Monday, and they held another press conference to talk about this because they're also going to wait to see what happens with this House vote. They're not enacting any immediate cuts or anything, and also because they're interpreting this cut that's the CR caused as they just can't exceed 2024 spending levels. We're not near right now exceeding 2024 spending levels at any city department, according to DC officials. So they're going to hold off on having to take any action, that would require cuts or layoffs or anything, as they wait to see what happens in the House, hope it's resolved. If it's not, then that is something that, they're already talking about contingency planning to where these cuts, once you start to, get close to your cap, the FY 2024 cap, that would require cutting down the line.
What's so remarkable about all of this is DC residents pay taxes. And let's get into the question of home rule here, James, and what DC is actually allowed to control and not control.
Well, home rule was something that came about during the Nixon presidency. It was carefully negotiated. Congress used to control who ran the district. It was a hard-won fight, really a part of the civil rights struggle in a lot of ways. The origin of pre-home rule coming out of the Civil War, when basically they didn't want African Americans to have the franchise, and they didn't want African Americans to have influence in the city. And it has now been half a century. It has largely been a success. There have been some rough financial periods, but essentially, this is there are House Republicans who don't think that DC should get to govern itself. This isn't a question of statehood, which was the fight when Democrats were in control.
When I said DC residents pay taxes, I didn't mean federal taxes. I meant city taxes. And so when we talk about the budget, a lot of this is DC residents' money, right? Yeah, and DC is a net contributor
this is. It's as Meagan was noting, every funding bill. It's crazy that DC even has this, but in this case, DC was treated basically like a federal agency instead of like a state government.
That's a great point.
That's how they're doing it.
So Meagan and the mayor has said we're not a federal agency. You can't just trim us down. That's right, and essentially that was the rationale that the House Speaker's office gave initially for why this was in the bill, that we were going to treat DC as a federal agency, and like all federal agencies, they're going to be stuck at FY 2024 spending levels. The difference, though, is that unlike federal agency, we have this active local budget that, as you mentioned, Libby, it's funded by local taxpayer dollars. And so the argument from DC officials is, why do you want to do this? This wouldn't save federal money. And that became a really critical point as this moved through Congress. I am fascinated watching how Mayor Bowser is navigating the second Trump presidency. Can you just talk a little bit, James, about how she's trying to walk this line of leading a Democratic majority city that's at the heart of where, Trump 2.0 lives.
Muriel Bowser knows how to deal with Donald Trump because she deals with people like him every day, which is developers. Donald Trump is essentially a developer who became a politician. That's how Bowser has approached him. The stuff he cares about, the stuff he complains about, things like homeless encampments, graffiti, noise. It's the same stuff developers care about. And so the mayor, who's been a business-friendly mayor in a city that has not always been business-friendly, he knows how to talk to people like Trump, knows how to play to his ego. And she has successfully threaded this needle. And it is a big contrast to the first term. And I think in a lot of ways is emblematic of the way people are dealing with Trump 2.0 versus Trump 1.0. She was a lot feistier, a lot more of a fighter the first time, really standing up to Trump. And this time, I think there's a recognition that we're going to have to deal with Donald Trump for 4 years. And so we want to figure out a way to work with him instead of just fighting with him all the time.
Trump threatened recently on social media to take over DC if the homeless camps couldn't be cleaned up, but now he's sort of backed away from that. Meagan, can you tell us more about that relationship?
Yeah, that was an interesting episode because we know that, homelessness, graffiti, some quality of life issues that Trump has really railed against whenever he's gone after DC. This was really a public test where you have the president on social media telling the mayor that this must be cleaned up. The administration apparently called the mayor, specifically noting one of the encampments that was near the State Department. And the mayor did have city workers respond pretty much immediately. And so, they noted that the city's always doing this, doing homeless encampment cleanups and trying to move people, whether into housing or to provide services. So they said this was just kind of part of our routine actions, but clearly, they expedited this and, the Trump administration did take notice.
Very symbolic gesture, demolishing Black Lives Matter Plaza. And this isn't just a paint job. I mean, they are literally breaking up the ground and repaving it, Rhonda.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been taking days. This actually goes back to a Republican House member. He's rank and file out of Georgia. He wrote legislation that Black Lives Matter Plaza should be demolished because he said it's divisive and should go back to the name of Liberty Plaza. And there you see some photos of the work being done. It's not just a paint job. They've got crews out there. But part of the reason he wanted this to be done, he, again, said it was divisive, but he also said if DC doesn't do this, then we should fight them on funding. And that's a part of sort of this looming issue with DC and its relationship with Congress, who does have constitutional authority over it, although there is the Home Rule Act, but they still can always dangle that funding and make it an issue for the local government. But now we're seeing the mayor, she said they have basically bigger fish to fry right now. They're not going to fight this and they'll move forward.
That's right. I mean, it was pretty immediate as well. I mean, he introduced the bill. The next day, the mayor said, we're going to be doing something else with Black Lives Matter Plaza now. And so that really was an immediate response. But I think the funding threat really does make a difference where the city, I mean, with all of that rhetoric on the campaign trail from Trump, as well as you noted, James, there are House Republicans and Senate Republicans who want to do away with home rule. They have introduced legislation. And when you have the combination of that rhetoric and a will among some, in Congress, that has put city officials really on edge and they're not willing to take a risk. And that was really what we saw was this, immediate response to do away with the plaza.
Meagan, before we let you go, what are you watching? Some of these, these next chess moves from either the mayor's office or the White House as these two leaders try to figure out how to move forward?
I really would love to see if President Trump says anything publicly about the DC bill fix. That would really, right now, the White House in just very short statements or, background, but President Trump himself would make a huge difference. And it would really kind of more publicly, put his and Bowser's relationship under more scrutiny if, he comes out with fuller support than has already been suggested. And then, as the homeless encampment issue indicated, there could be other things where the White House says, we want you to do this, Mayor. Please get on it now. And will she do it? I think that's a huge question as, we look at other issues in the city, especially around crime, where, the White House or congressional Republicans might try to get some more movement on their own priorities with the city's cooperation.
This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. You can listen to us on your favorite podcast app or listen to us and watch along on YouTube. Just look for the Washington Post. Welcome back, Emily Davies, who covers the impact of the Trump administration and the federal government on D.C. It's like the busiest beat in the newsroom, and that is saying something because this is a very busy place these days. So DOGE has been popping up all around Washington, and it is fascinating to see how reporters get the tips that they've showed up. How does that process work, Emily?
So it's actually a funny time that you ask this because somebody just tagged me on Twitter saying that they had read a piece I'd written and they thought I might want to know that DOGE is currently at this particular building. So this is right now. So I think, people see what's going on and it's a little bit, it's a lot jarring. These are young guys, often from Silicon Valley, nothing to do with the government. One of them is known as Big Balls, and then he shows up in the office or shows up on Zoom and people freak out. And so they want to tell somebody, their bosses either can't respond or don't want to respond. And so the media feels like the next step. So,
and it's not pre-announced, they're literally just showing up, right?
I guess it's a question of who it's pre-announced to.
Great point.
Maybe some managers know, but certainly the people who are in my DMs are surprised.
Great point. James, DOGE staffers raided, and I'm using that word specifically, raided the headquarters of the Institute of Peace this week. What did they do? What happened?
A dramatic, almost cinematic encounter. So the U.S. Institute of Peace, for those who've been to Washington, is this big, dramatic building, but it is technically not a government agency. The people who work there are not government employees. And basically what happened was the DOGE folks showed up. They were initially turned away, and they enlisted the U.S. attorney for D.C. Interim right now, Ed Martin, and he got the FBI involved, and then they got the D.C. police involved by saying that there was trespassing. And so essentially all these armed federal and local officers show up, and they basically forcibly enter this building, and the Institute's president was removed, and then they installed someone new, and they then the people who were pushed out went to court, and
but the judge isn't stopping it. This is what
right.
the judge denied their request to stop the DOGE takeover.
So Judge Beryl Howell said that they can continue to file this lawsuit, but that they couldn't prove that they'll be irreparably harmed by being forced out of the building for now. But she was strongly critical of the DOGE folks for the way that they used basically guns to get control of this building that's not even a federal building and that's not full of federal employees.
Yeah, she said the government's efforts were probably terrorizing employees. To give you a sense of her reaction, James. This
is America. This is happening in Washington, D.C. This is the kind of thing that you would expect to happen in a country where there was some sort of forcible takeover, or this is just not the way transitions happen. What the Trump folks would say is, yeah, normally people don't resist the administration from coming in and asking questions and looking at data. But the people in this agency say, well, there's a proper channel and a proper way to do this, and you're not going through it. So it ends up creating this dramatic clash. And this is happening across the government.
Let's talk about some of the agencies and organizations that have been most recently hit, Emily. I'm thinking Voice of America. Tell us about what else has been hit by DOGE.
Yeah, there was this late Friday executive order that targeted some of these smaller agencies. The one I'm thinking of most, I know the Voice of America has gotten a lot of press, and it should. It's a storied institution, really, independent agency established by Congress that tries to counter more authoritarian news. But the Woodrow Wilson Center is also a really interesting example to look at here. The Woodrow Wilson Center is known, it considers itself a nonpartisan think tank. It's run currently by a former Republican congressman. It's got board members associated with the RNC. And its budget, it requested something like $14 million this year from the federal government, which when you put that against the deficit and the total budget is peanuts. And so it feels like DOGE coming after that particular agency is not indicative necessarily of its determination to cut costs, and is maybe more revealing of priorities and like a judgment call on what the federal government should be doing.
Rhonda, let's talk about some of the politics of this, because Emily makes a great point about the motivations. And I think the Trump team, admits to having multiple motivations really in doing some of this. But one of the things I learned from Emily's reporting is that a regulation that Trump has canceled was a Biden order that raised the minimum wage for federal contractors to $15 an hour. That's gone. And there's some other things that are specifically targeting labor and targeting like community activism, rules and protections that are environmental protections and things like that. What does this do to like Trump's base of working class Americans who might benefit from some of these laws?
Yeah, I think we've all seen countless interviews right now with people who voted for Trump and now saying, well, we didn't sign up for this. And I think it also highlights how sweeping and broad these, the dismantling of agencies or going into agencies and changing them, cutting them, how big it is, because it's affecting people in his base. It's affecting everyone. So it is something that I think might have some political ramifications down the line. We might see that when the current members of Congress start going on the campaign trail for the midterms to see if there's any backlash from all of this. But these changes are so sweeping that, of course, Republicans and people who voted for Trump are going to be affected.
Firing and then trying to rehire workers sounds easy enough. Emily, how complicated is it?
Yeah, it really is a mess. I talked to one person the other day who was a probationary employee fired, and she was so worried about her health care that she moved up her wedding. She and her fiance were supposed to get married over the summer, but was staring down months without health care and got married in a courthouse in New York City instead. And then a week later got the call that she was rehired. So I think that's like a really good example of how the chaos is having real impact on people's lives. And
I just want to mention the probationary employees, which we've talked about, but I think it's good to have a refresher. Those aren't people necessarily who are on probation for poor work. They might have been recent hires. There are plenty of people who you've reported on who've said, look, my work record was stellar, but I still was given this probationary status and let go.
Right. That's a really important point. It's people who've been in their jobs for 1 or 2 years. And that actually can include veterans and people who've been in the federal government for a very long time and recently were promoted actually because of good performance.
So it's more complicated to rehire people, but also do people want to go back to work in the federal government?
Yeah, I've heard mixed, honestly. I think there are some people who really do, who loved their former jobs, who miss their colleagues, who miss the day-to-day work. A lot of people are really happy with their government jobs. And then there are people like this woman who've changed their entire lives. Some of them have moved and some of them have gotten new jobs. And the government is losing real talent this way. And I think you can see even the president himself aware of that.
To bring this back to Washington, D.C., James, what do you see as some of the sort of the legacy impacts this is starting to leave already?
It's taking an economic toll. I was talking to a guy over drinks last night who's trying to sell his house and he's going to have to accept way less than the asking price because there's a lot of supply and people are they're reducing the size of the federal workforce and people are scared. People aren't buying. Unemployment claims are starting to come in. We talked in the last segment about the DC budget. This is going to really impact the DC tax base. And interestingly, more people are coming into downtown DC and kind of creating a demand for services at the same time that you're reducing the volume of people who are paying taxes
because of the return to work
and in-person policy. I mean, the irony of all this and DC is at its most beautiful right now. The cherry blossoms are all starting to come out. It's spring, but it's a dark time for a lot of folks who are filing for unemployment, looking to leave town, making dramatic life decisions, as Emily was just talking about, but really fear. I mean, the fear is very palpable. There was a lot of in January kind of like, oh, we'll see what before the inauguration, we'll see what happens. Maybe Trump will be different this time. But Trump turned out to go much further than he campaigned on and than anything he did in the first term in terms of like actually going at the what Trump calls the deep state, but it's really just human beings who are federal workers, civil servants, for the most part, totally nonpartisan.
There are also cultural changes in the city, and the arts are always impacted by politics in some really fascinating ways. But we're seeing like the Kennedy Center radically transform right now, Rhonda.
Yeah, we are. And that is a place that not only people in DC, but the outer areas and people out of the area come to see shows. They have a lot of programming, arts programming for kids who attend DC schools. I know a teacher who the program that she uses in her art classes is now canceled because it was a part of the DEI executive orders. So there are going to be cultural changes with any administration that comes into DC, but this one is pretty dramatic and it's happening all at once. And I'll add on to what James was saying about the economic impact. Remember, DOGE has said they are going to cancel leases for federal government buildings, and that's across the nation. You know, there are offices in other cities, but that will have an effect, no doubt, on DC. You will have empty offices that will affect the commercial real estate economy, and even with the federal workers who are here and have lost their job. You know, they're not going to go out to restaurants. They're not going to go to shows. They're not going to do things that will add to the economic engine of the district, and that the district will likely see that impact very quickly.
Emily, are we seeing a more conservative footprint, sort of culturally, socially in DC?
Yeah, I like to think of it as like a split screen that's happening right now. In some bars, there are people leaving federal agencies with boxes and like drinking away their sorrows, basically, like with their colleagues for the last time. It's a sort of melancholy communal feel. But then in other bars in DC, there are young conservatives who are celebrating the golden age that they believe is upon us. So, for example, in a week or two, there is an event near the Supreme Court at a bar called Make America Hot Again. And that is put on by conservative young women and men, I think, who are going to go celebrate together and get dressed up. And I don't know how that event might have been received a few years ago, but right now I think it will be pretty well attended.
One of the other big shifts that President Trump is making, Rhonda, is President Trump is signing an executive order with the goal of eliminating the Department of Education. What is Trump aiming to do, and what can he do without Congress signing off on it?
Well, Congress does have to vote on whether or not to officially remove the Department of Ed as a cabinet agency, a federal agency. We were expecting this from Trump. In fact, we've been waiting for weeks to see if he would put out an executive order. So we were expecting that later today. Right now, we know that he has directed Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education, to work on dismantling it. They already have cut half of the workforce with the Department of Ed, and it is one of the smaller agencies as well. So that should be noted. That is not a lot of people, but they do a lot of work. Some of the numbers that I found earlier today, the Department of Education manages nearly $2 trillion in federal student loan money. So where does that go? We don't quite know yet. Trump has floated the idea of sending that over to the Treasury Department to handle.
Commerce.
Right, or Commerce. But also the Department of Ed manages billions of dollars that goes to federal funding to K through 12 schools across the country. Now, what you're hearing from Republicans is that education should return to the states. Largely, local school boards, local municipalities, they do handle the local funding for schools. But there are, as I said, billions of dollars that often go to school lunch programs, programs to help disadvantaged youth, programs to help homeless students, programs to ensure civil rights policies are being followed.
Closing the education department is not popular among Americans, James. And yet this is a pledge that Trump has had on the campaign trail for a long time.
The White House is backing off of its pledge to eliminate the Department of Education. They do not have the votes. They're not going to get the votes. And they have various functions that are required legally to be done. And the most popular of those functions, especially helping special needs children and various like FAFSA student loan applications, they are saying we're going to continue to do those. We'll do them more efficiently with fewer resources. We don't need all the staff that the Department of Education had. It's the smallest cabinet agency by employees already, even before they cut half the staff. And so basically what the executive order is doing is everything short of getting rid of the agency and still complying with the law.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, James, Emily. Great to talk to all of you. This will be a story that we keep hearing more from you on, Emily, as the weeks roll by. Really appreciate your time. Thank you to our audience for listening to this episode of Sidebar. We're here every Tuesday and Thursday, so we look forward to talking with you again next week.